August 15, 1971. The world watched as President Nixon severed the dollar's final tie to gold, declaring it a bold move for economic freedom. But what if that Sunday night announcement wasn't liberation at all? What if it was the moment global money quietly fell under centralized control? Behind the headlines of floating currencies and market flexibility, a different system emerged, one where monetary policy escaped public oversight and entered the hands of unelected technocrats. This wasn't the end of financial tyranny, it was the blueprint for something far more permanent. A currency system governed not by gold or government, but by control itself. On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon appeared on national television and calmly declared the suspension of dollar convertibility to gold. Framed as a temporary emergency measure to combat currency speculators and protect the American economy, the announcement shattered the global monetary architecture that had defined the post-war era. What few understood in that moment was that Nixon had not freed the dollar from constraint. He had freed those in power from accountability. For nearly 3 decades, the Bretton Woods system had tied global currencies to the U.S. dollar, which itself was convertible into gold, at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. This tether, while imperfect and increasingly strained, served one crucial function. It imposed limits. Nations could only expand their money supply so far before gold outflows disciplined their behavior. Nixon's action removed that last check, and in its place rose something far more opaque. Monetary creation was no longer governed by physical scarcity, but by political will and institutional consensus. Power quietly shifted from elected officials to unelected technocrats in central banks, finance ministries, and international bodies. These institutions could now conjure liquidity at will or strangle economies through contraction, all without public debate or electoral consequences. The Federal Reserve, once constrained by gold redemption fears, was unleashed to manage not just interest rates but entire economic trajectories through tools like open market operations and reserve requirements. The International Monetary Fund and the Bank for International Settlements, previously constrained to coordination roles, grew in reach and relevance, becoming architects of capital flows and enforcers of policy orthodoxy. In removing the gold anchor, the system did not become freer, it became more controllable. The mechanisms of that control were subtle: inflation targets, monetary aggregates, central bank independence. All of them were couched in the language of economic efficiency and technocratic expertise, yet every one of them placed more distance between citizens and the decisions that governed their financial lives. Monetary policy, once a reflection of national solvency, became a domain of simulation, where models replaced constraints and accountability dissolved behind spreadsheets and forecasts. Nixon's shock was marketed as a patriotic defense of American strength, but its effect was the quiet centralization of global monetary power. Markets initially soared. Leaders across the Western world praised the United States for decisive action. Yet behind the press releases and optimism, a silent architecture was being erected, one in which money could be manipulated without permission, wealth could be diluted without notice, and the levers of economic control slipped beyond public reach. The gold standard had its flaws, but it imposed a discipline that no longer exists. What replaced it was not a freer system, but a more elastic and manipulable one, designed not to restrain power, but to protect and perpetuate it. The consequences of that shift would not be fully understood for decades, but the foundation had been laid. Control had been mistaken for freedom, and the price of that illusion was about to reshape the world. Long before Nixon's television address, the seeds of monetary disintegration had already been sown in a quiet warning issued by a French economist few Americans had ever heard of. Jacques Rueff, once financial advisor to Charles de Gaulle and one of the original architects of interwar European monetary policy, had watched the Bretton Woods system with increasing alarm. From its inception in 1944, Rueff argued that anchoring global finance on a dollar still convertible to gold was not a stable foundation but a mathematical contradiction in motion. Under Bretton Woods, the U.S. dollar was the pivot of world trade, accepted globally as if it were gold itself. But unlike gold, dollars could be created endlessly by printing, not mining, and Rueff understood what that implied. The only way for the world to gain dollar liquidity was for the United States to run persistent trade deficits. These deficits were not fiscal mistakes, They were structural requirements. If America balanced its books, the world would face a dollar shortage. If it didn't, then other nations would accumulate dollars in excess, eventually trying to redeem them for gold. This loop, Roof predicted, would stretch until America's gold reserves were overwhelmed, triggering either default or collapse. His critique was dismissed in Washington as European pessimism, outdated gold standard thinking incompatible with modern Keynesianism. But behind the scenes, the French central bank watched Rueff's calculations play out year after year with unnerving accuracy. By the late 1950s, the U.S. had already run nearly a decade of continuous deficits. Dollar reserves ballooned across Europe, while American gold stocks shrank. De Gaulle's France acted on Rueff's warnings in 1965, demanding physical gold shipments from the U.S. Treasury. Washington responded not with reform but with resentment, branding Rueff's logic as sabotage. Yet his model was no ideology, it was arithmetic. As deficits grew, dollar issuance fueled inflation that spread globally. The system exported not just liquidity, but monetary distortion, embedding the American economic cycle into every corner of the world. Nations holding dollar reserves now faced a dilemma. If they redeemed dollars, they collapsed the system. If they didn't, they lost value to U.S. inflation. The game only worked if everyone played along, and Rueff had predicted the moment they wouldn't. America's monetary planners knew that maintaining dollar dominance required ever-expanding deficits. Yet gold convertibility made this impossible in the long run. Rueff's fatal flaw was no bug. It was baked into the logic of the system, and American policymakers quietly embraced it. Deficits weren't a threat. They were a tool. Inflation wasn't an error. It was a weaponized export. The illusion of stability depended on everyone pretending gold still backed the dollar. But behind closed doors, Washington had already chosen a different path. Sacrifice gold, embrace debt, and let the rest of the world pay the price. Rueff's equation didn't fail. It played out with perfect precision, ignored not because it was wrong, but because it was right and inconvenient. By the early 1960s, Jacques Rueff's warnings were echoed with new academic rigor by Robert Triffin, a Yale economist who laid out the paradox now bearing his name. Triffin observed that for the global economy to function under Bretton Woods, the U.S. had to supply an ever-growing quantity of dollars to serve as international reserves. But to do so, it had to run persistent trade and budget deficits, sending out more dollars than it received. This global service role made the dollar indispensable, yet inherently unstable. The more dollars America exported, the greater the strain on its own gold reserves, and the more fragile trust in convertibility became. Triffin's dilemma wasn't merely a policy challenge, it was a contradiction baked into the system's foundation. Rather than resolve the tension, American policymakers learned to exploit it. They realized that global dollar demand granted them an unprecedented privilege: the ability to run deficits without facing the same consequences as other nations. These deficits, once seen as threats to monetary integrity, were reframed as instruments of global leadership. The world needed dollars, and America could print them. It was a position no empire had held before, able to finance its global influence not through tribute or surplus, but through debt that others were compelled to absorb. With gold redemption growing riskier and foreign demands escalating, U.S. policymakers began to lean into the imbalance. Budget discipline gave way to monetary expansion. Defense spending, social programs, and foreign aid were all financed through deficits with little immediate penalty. The world absorbed the inflation, the IOUs, and the risk. Every dollar spent abroad became both a tool of economic policy and a geopolitical weapon. American deficits were no longer symptoms of overreach. They were the engine of dollar hegemony. Central banks in Europe and Asia continued to accumulate U.S. debt, not out of confidence, but because they had no alternative. A new form of coercion emerged, invisible yet binding. Foreign nations couldn't abandon the dollar without collapsing their own reserves. Trust was no longer the glue holding the system together. Dependence was. And as dependency deepened, American officials stopped trying to restore balance. The contradiction that Triffin exposed was no longer a flaw to be fixed, but a feature to be managed. The system didn't fail because it was unsustainable. It persisted because no one could afford its failure. And so deficits became not a liability, but a strategy. Debt became the currency of control. As long as the world needed dollars, the United States could print power. And every attempt to break away from that orbit would trigger a crisis that reminded smaller nations where true monetary gravity lay. The Triffin dilemma, once a warning, became a blueprint. What was once feared as systemic fragility had been recast as imperial architecture, unseen, unvoted, and virtually unopposed. Bretton Woods began as a grand bargain, an agreement forged in the dying embers of World War II, meant to ensure peace through economic stability. 44 nations had signed on, trusting that a dollar backed by gold would offer a dependable foundation for world trade. For a time, the system worked. The U.S., with its unmatched gold reserves and industrial dominance, became the central bank of the world. But by the 1960s, that trust had curdled into suspicion. Foreign central banks, flush with dollars from America's expanding deficits, began to question whether the gold promised in exchange actually existed in sufficient quantity. France was the first to call the bluff. Influenced by Jacques Rueff and determined to preserve monetary sovereignty, President Charles de Gaulle ordered the Banque de France to convert its dollar holdings into physical gold. French naval vessels docked in New York Harbor, loading tons of bullion once held in trust by the U.S. Treasury. Other nations followed, quietly at first, then urgently. Germany, Switzerland, and the Netherlands began making similar moves, repatriating their wealth before the window slammed shut. By 1970, America's gold reserves had been drained from a post-war peak of over 20,000 tons to barely half that. The arithmetic was no longer abstract, it was existential. If foreign claims on U.S. gold were honored, Fort Knox would be empty within years. The architects of Bretton Woods had promised a system of fixed exchange rates stabilized by gold. But the United States had quietly turned it into a system of privilege. Dollars were printed, deficits ballooned, and the rest of the world was expected to absorb the consequences. Now the world wanted its gold back, and the trap was closing. The U.S. faced an impossible choice: tighten monetary policy, shrink deficits, and risk recession, or default on the promise that dollars were as good as gold. In truth, Washington had already made its decision. Internal memos circulated within the Treasury and the Federal Reserve, acknowledging that convertibility could not be maintained. Still, the illusion was preserved until the breaking point. That point came on a summer night in 1971 when Nixon ended convertibility unilaterally without consulting allies. The move was billed as protection from foreign speculators, but it was in fact a betrayal of the system America had authored and led. Bretton Woods hadn't collapsed because it was outdated. It was abandoned because the U.S. could no longer exploit it without consequence. The trap had been sprung, not on the world, but on the very nation that built it. Rather than honor the rules, America rewrote them. The dollar would no longer be gold-backed. It would be backed by decree, by power, by the same trust it had just broken. In that moment, the post-war dream of international cooperation gave way to something colder, a world where monetary rules were optional for the issuer, and obligations were binding only on the ruled. Once the gold anchor was severed, the world didn't descend into chaos. It reorganized around a new set of architects. These weren't elected officials or treaty negotiators, but central bankers, monetary bureaucrats, and international technocrats whose power surged precisely because it was invisible. With the constraints of Bretton Woods removed, global finance entered a new era of discretion, orchestrated not by the invisible hand of markets, but by the deliberate coordination of institutions like the Federal Reserve, the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the Bank for International Settlements, BIS. The Federal Reserve, once a national entity charged with managing domestic inflation and employment, began to operate as the de facto central bank of the world. Its decisions on interest rates triggered capital flows across borders, impacting currencies and credit markets far beyond American shores. Meanwhile, the IMF, initially conceived to uphold exchange rate stability, evolved into a global economic regulator. Countries in crisis no longer sought gold or bilateral loans. They queued up for IMF assistance, which came with strings, structural adjustments, spending cuts, tax reforms, and monetary policy changes dictated not by domestic need but by international consensus. Behind it all, the BIS in Basel, Switzerland, became the quiet meeting ground where central bankers convened monthly to align their strategies, share confidential data, and decide the trajectory of global liquidity. There, under the pretext of stability, they hashed out monetary targets, set informal norms, and established a language of policy that excluded almost everyone not wearing a tailored suit or carrying a doctorate in new economics. Democracy had no seat at the table. These institutions were not beholden to voters, yet they governed the oxygen of the modern economy, money. Interest rates became the new borders, swap lines the new alliances. If a nation's currency faltered, it was not tanks or treaties that came to the rescue, but lines of liquidity extended from one central bank to another, often without public disclosure or parliamentary approval. Monetary policy had migrated from national capitals to technocratic conclaves, from transparent debate to confidential memos. And this wasn't a conspiracy, it was a new orthodoxy. The discipline once enforced by gold had been replaced by the judgment of committees, the models of economists, and the discretion of chairmen. Countries that resisted this architecture found themselves isolated from capital markets or punished through currency collapse. Compliance wasn't legislated, it was priced into bond yields, credit ratings, and IMF forecasts. The entire system operated through signals, not commands, and those who misunderstood the signals paid the price. In this new infrastructure, the market was not a free space, but a managed arena shaped subtly but powerfully by a network of institutions whose only mandate was to prevent disruption. But disruption to what? To a system that no longer answered to the people it governed. The gold window had closed, but another had opened, one that looked less like a republic and more like a control room, quiet, air-conditioned, and decisively undemocratic. In the aftermath of Nixon's gold shock, the dollar faced a legitimacy crisis. No longer convertible into anything tangible, it risked unraveling as the global reserve currency, unless a new foundation could be forged. That foundation was oil. In 1974, amidst the turbulence of the Yom Kippur War and an oil embargo that had paralyzed Western economies, the United States brokered a secret agreement with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. The terms were simple yet transformative. In exchange for U.S. military protection and arms sales, Saudi Arabia would price all of its oil exports exclusively in U.S. dollars. Within a few years, every OPEC nation had followed suit. The result was a seismic monetary shift, the creation of the Petrodollar system. Unlike gold, oil was not a store of value but a daily necessity. Every country needed it, and now every country needed dollars to get it. Global energy transactions became dollar-dependent, creating a new and artificial floor for dollar demand. This was not a market phenomenon. It was a geopolitical engineering project. Suddenly, dollars were not just a currency, they were a passport to energy. Nations that previously had little exposure to the U.S. financial system were now forced to hold dollars in reserve, recycle surpluses into U.S. treasuries, and play by Washington's monetary rules. This allowed the United States to run fiscal and trade deficits with impunity, while other countries had to balance their books to preserve currency stability. The U.S. could simply print more dollars, confident the world would absorb them to purchase oil. Inflation, once a domestic political risk, became an exportable commodity. Foreign nations bore the cost of dollar depreciation, their savings diluted by America's monetary expansion. Meanwhile, the flow of petrodollars back into U.S. financial markets funded American debt at artificially low interest rates, creating a feedback loop of power disguised as liquidity. Oil producers, swimming in surplus dollars, invested in Wall Street assets, U.S. bonds, and defense contracts, cementing a geopolitical alliance that married energy supply to dollar supremacy. And this wasn't just a fiscal tool, it was a weapon. Nations that defied the system found themselves economically isolated. Iraq's decision to sell oil in euros, Libya's call for a gold-backed African currency, Iran's barter arrangements with China, each became a prelude to sanctions, regime change, or war. The petrodollar made energy not just a resource but an instrument of global order, a monetary leash cloaked in the machinery of diplomacy. While the public was told that markets governed prices and alliances preserved peace, a deeper mechanism was at work, an empire of demand sculpted through necessity. The dollar's dominance wasn't sustained by trust or productivity, but by the simple, brutal fact that every nation needed fuel. And to get fuel, they needed dollars. In that need lay obedience, and in that obedience, control. What gold had once constrained, oil now sustained, but on terms written in Washington and enforced with aircraft carriers. The collapse of Bretton Woods in the early 1970s ushered in what appeared to be a new era of monetary freedom. Currencies would now float, their values set by market forces rather than fixed pegs. Newspapers hailed the dawn of liberalized exchange rates, and economists spoke of efficient markets finding natural balance. But beneath the rhetoric of liberation, a deeper structure remained intact. Floating currencies didn't end control, they merely concealed it. As volatility surged through foreign exchange markets in the 1980s, central banks stepped from the shadows. The most revealing moment came in 1985 with the Plaza Accord. The dollar had appreciated to dangerous levels, hurting American exports and triggering global imbalances. In response, finance ministers from the world's 5 largest economies, the US, Japan, West Germany, France, and the UK, met at the Plaza Hotel in New York and agreed to engineer a coordinated devaluation of the dollar. The move was not legislative, not subject to parliamentary approval or public debate, but executed through joint market interventions that reshaped the global monetary landscape overnight. Within 2 years, the dollar lost nearly 50% of its value against the yen and the Deutsche Mark. Then came the Louvre Accord in 1987, an agreement among the same powers to halt the dollar's decline and stabilize exchange rates within implicit target bands. Again, it was sold as cooperation among equals. In practice, it was a demonstration of dominance, a signal that the floating system was in fact a controlled float, managed by the very institutions it had supposedly outgrown. Currency markets became battlegrounds for coordinated policy, not arenas of free price discovery. Central banks set interest rate targets not merely to influence domestic inflation, but to guide cross-border capital flows and defend invisible exchange rate thresholds. Derivative markets, once tools for hedging risk, became instruments for speculative positioning that central banks could manipulate through subtle signaling and liquidity adjustments. The illusion of free-floating currencies created plausible deniability. Crashes and spikes were blamed on sentiment, data releases, or investor psychology, while behind the scenes swap lines were extended, interventions executed, and monetary alignments forged in closed-door summits. The facade of freedom concealed a carefully choreographed regime, policed by a handful of institutions that claimed to protect stability, but in truth preserved a hierarchy. When developing countries faced currency crises, Mexico in 1994, East Asia in 1997, Russia in 1998, they were told the markets had judged them harshly. But when the US or Europe faced similar risks, global coordination sprang to life. Central banks didn't release control, they refined it. They learned to move without being seen, to influence without appearing to command. In a system where values float, trust sinks unless someone manages the currents. And the managers were always there, anchoring the illusion of freedom to a very real architecture of power. As money evolved from paper to code, the levers of monetary control evolved with it, quietly, seamlessly, and with a precision that older empires could only dream of. Gone were the days when financial warfare required blockades or physical occupation. In the digital age, a nation's economy could be isolated with a keystroke. At the heart of this transformation stood a trio of gatekeeping institutions: SWIFT, the BIS, and an increasingly militarized U.S. Treasury. SWIFT, the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication, began as a neutral messaging system for banks. But as digital transactions became the bloodstream of the global economy, SWIFT became the switchboard of international finance. By the 2000s, denying a country access to SWIFT meant severing its ability to move money, settle trade, or service debt. It was no longer a tool of commerce, it was a lever of compliance. When the U.S. pressured SWIFT to disconnect Iranian banks in 2012, Tehran's economy ground to a halt, without a single missile fired. In that moment, the geopolitical battlefield moved from the straits and deserts to server farms and encrypted protocols. Parallel to SWIFT's rise, the Bank for International Settlements in Basel quietly expanded its role from coordination to infrastructure. Central banks used the BIS not just to discuss policy, but to route reserves, settle liquidity swaps, and administer backdoor bailouts far from public view. It became the motherboard of global monetary architecture, a place where capital moved frictionlessly, but only for those aligned with its protocols. To be outside the system wasn't just inconvenient, it was terminal. The U.S. Treasury, emboldened by this architecture, turned sanctions from blunt diplomatic gestures into precision-guided financial warfare. Individuals, corporations, and entire economies could be blacklisted from the dollar-based system, frozen out of trade, and cut off from credit. Compliance wasn't optional, it was existential. Banks worldwide became unwilling enforcers, de-risking clients, halting transactions, and flagging behavior, not out of law, but out of fear. A misplaced transaction, a suspicious connection, a flagged name, any one of these could trigger account closures, frozen assets, or reputational exile. And unlike kinetic warfare, there was no Geneva Convention for monetary strikes. Collateral damage was routine. Civilian banks, ordinary citizens, aid organizations, all caught in the blast radius of digital financial targeting. The rise of central bank digital currencies promises to extend this architecture even further. With programmable money, access can be granted or revoked in real time, based not on balance but on behavior. Geography no longer protects sovereignty. In a world where capital flows are watched, routed, and ultimately permitted by networks of unelected technocrats, freedom becomes conditional. In this new regime, invasion is obsolete. Obedience is enforced not with tanks, but with timeouts, your economy placed in read-only mode. And the greatest irony? Most nations signed onto this infrastructure willingly, trading independence for convenience, unaware that the price of participation was their last lever of resistance. By the time the dollar had fully replaced gold as the axis of international finance, it was no longer just a medium of exchange. It had become a weapon. The United States, no longer constrained by convertibility, discovered that its most powerful export was not oil, not technology, not even culture, but debt. In the decades that followed the collapse of Bretton Woods, developing nations who once might have demanded gold found themselves forced to borrow dollars instead. These weren't neutral loans, they came packaged through global institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, presented as aid but structured as leverage. Nations in crisis, facing currency collapse or capital flight, were offered rescue, on the condition that they surrender economic sovereignty. IMF structural adjustment programs demanded austerity, subsidy cuts, currency devaluation, public sector layoffs, and privatization of national assets. World Bank loans financed infrastructure, but required legal reforms that rewrote the relationship between state and capital. The result was not recovery, it was obedience. In country after country, debt became a tool to extract compliance. Governments were forced to choose between default and submission. And since default triggered isolation from international markets, most submitted. Sovereignty was traded for liquidity. Elected governments could no longer make policy without consulting foreign creditors. Ministers of finance took their cues not from voters, but from Washington technocrats and World Bank auditors. In the global South, entire generations grew up under regimes of external management. Hospitals closed, currency collapsed, land was auctioned to foreign investors. And yet the loans kept coming, not to build resilience, but to ensure dependence. The more a country borrowed, the more collateral could be seized through privatization. The creditor had become the lawmaker. Even wealthy nations weren't immune. In the Eurozone, states that borrowed too heavily were disciplined not by armies but by bond markets. Greece, Italy, and Spain were subjected to brutal fiscal oversight, their budgets effectively written in Brussels and Frankfurt. No gold was required, no conquest was necessary, just spreadsheets, yield curves, and IMF memoranda. Debt was no longer a symptom of weakness, it was a strategy of control. And the dollar system ensured that control remained centralized, because to borrow in dollars meant to kneel to dollar issuers. Countries that tried alternatives, gold, barter, bilateral trade, were punished through sanctions, ratings downgrades, or exclusion from capital markets. Nations no longer needed to be invaded to be conquered. A loan agreement could do the same job, with better optics. The empire of debt didn't march, it negotiated. It drafted loan conditions, it assessed creditworthiness, It offered liquidity in exchange for legislation. And in that quiet transaction, it rewrote the meaning of independence. Debt had become a chain that looked like a lifeline, and those who held the chain didn't need to govern. They only needed others to believe there was no way out. The day the United States closed the gold window, it did not set the dollar free. It set the stage for a new era of control masked as liberty. What began as a suspension of convertibility evolved into a system where the very idea of monetary freedom became a branding exercise. Floating currencies, digital payments, mobile banking, global markets, all the trappings of modern financial life were sold as hallmarks of individual empowerment. But beneath the surface, a deeper architecture emerged, one in which money itself was no longer a neutral medium of exchange, but a mechanism of compliance. The shift was subtle, yet absolute. Where once value was tethered to a physical reserve, now it was tethered to policy discretion, credit scores, liquidity injections, and the shifting whims of central planners. Monetary policy, once a reactive instrument, became a proactive force, shaping behavior, allocating capital, and punishing dissent. Those who printed the money no longer merely stabilized economies, they managed societies. This was not the free market imagined by post-war economists or the liberal order envisioned by Bretton Woods. It was a closed system, self-reinforcing and globally integrated, where access to capital depended not on merit but on alignment. Nations that resisted the system faced capital flight, sanctions, or sudden crises of confidence. Individuals deemed high risk by algorithms, not laws, found themselves debanked, deplatformed, or priced out of financial participation. Freedom became a conditional privilege rather than an inalienable right. The marketplace was no longer a contest of equals, but a rigged game in which the rules changed based on who controlled the monetary narrative. And the narrative was clear. There is no alternative. Every financial innovation, digital wallets, programmable currencies, real-time settlement, tightened the net. Every crisis justified more intervention. Every bailout entrenched more power. The institutions that emerged after 1971 claimed neutrality, but operated as gatekeepers, defining the boundaries of permissible economic activity. This is the final irony of the post-gold world. By removing the anchor, the system claimed to liberate itself from constraint. But in truth, it replaced the tyranny of scarcity with the tyranny of discretion. The handcuffs weren't removed, they became invisible. And in that invisibility, the real danger took root. When people believe they are free while every action is mediated through an infrastructure designed to monitor, guide, and if necessary, deny, then true freedom has already been lost. We do not live in the age of monetary freedom. We live in the architecture of engineered dependence, a world where the currency you earn, the savings you store, and the transactions you make are all recorded, modeled, and permissioned. And those who shape that architecture don't answer to voters, nations, or markets. They answer only to themselves. The system was never liberated, it was rebooted. The gold vaults were closed, but the vault of control was thrown open, and inside it stood the future, coded, managed, and irrevocably closed.